Good morning, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome in track one if this is your first visit here. My name is Remkes de Vries and I'll be your MC. Thank you. That was uncalled for, but okay. Our next speaker is Victor Santoyo. Has anyone of you ever had security issues with your website? Hacked maybe, something weird like that? No? Nobody? Ooh, you have a lot to learn then. Victor knows everything about that. He's seen, what was it, every nook and cranny of the whole security thing. He works at Sucuri, and he's been doing 7 years of essentially seeing everything you can imagine having to do with security, for at least online security, I should say. He's mostly working on onboarding partners, but he loves a few other things as well. Running, I don't know from what, but I think the love of cookies is probably triggering it. Am I right? Anyway, welcome Victor Santoyo.
Thank you, Michael. Woo! Good morning. How are we doing today? That didn't sound good at all. This is track second session today. How are we doing today? Yeah. All right. So, thanks for the kind introduction. As mentioned, my name is Victor Santoyo. That's my handle if you want to follow me on the Twitter, of course. I share mostly security-related topics there. But as mentioned, I also do dabble in other things. But before getting into that, I mentioned I do have 7 years with Sucuri website security, who I'll touch on in a second. I work primarily on the agency and enterprise team, so I work with a lot of different types of organizations, and I'll share a couple of those stories throughout the course of this presentation to get you to understand how security impacts everyone equally, right? There's no one specific topic or target or audience when it comes to website security. But before getting into any of that, if you've ever seen me speak at any other sessions, WordCamp Miami or others, I like to start with a little bit about myself, because otherwise I might be rambling on about the same old, so I like to introduce something new, which is usually personal. So on the right, you'll see my wonderful family, my wife who's in the crowd today, and my 2 little boys, 6 and 3 as of now. But as mentioned, I am into running and just recently got into CrossFit. So after the session, if you're into either of these things, please find me. I would love to expand and learn more about these 2 things. I've been running for feels like almost 10 years, but there's always a little bit 1% better you can be, a little bit more you can learn. I'm out of Miami. Anyone out of Florida here in the crowd? Really? Yes, sweet. Shout out to Florida. So again, if you're also in the area, by all means, reach out. Who knows, we can meet up in person away from the event and get to know each other. But those colors didn't seem right. Now, these are our company colors, and this makes me feel a little more comfortable. So I'm switching up the presentation here to fit the theme of security. Now, what are the credentials I bring to the topic? So I work for a company known as Sucuri Website Security. The name is Brazilian-based in nature. If you have more questions on how to pronounce it, what it actually means, you can find me after. But what we do primarily is monitor, protect, and help websites in the event of an incident. So if you're hacked, as was touched on, or if you're facing any other issues, we can solve that problem for you. Now, one of the things that we often see in the course of fixing those issues is simply trends, right? You clean enough websites, you see enough issues, you'll often have a better indication of what could be coming up as a new technique, a variance, an evolution of something we've already seen. So what we're going to focus on in the course of this presentation are what have we learned over the previous calendar year that we can take into this year and moving forward about some of the trends that can help us better prepare and empower ourselves to prevent the inevitable, prevent an infection. Now, the way we do this normally, actually, in terms of how we can give back to the WordPress community and others, is doing what we call a hacked research reports. It's a review. It gives us all indications of things that we've seen from websites that we've cleaned. Thousands and thousands of websites, tens of thousands over the course of the year. And so we can put that together in a way for you to understand what we're seeing, what we can learn from it, so that people are aware of what's going on actively as you start a WordPress journey. One of the things, though, that I will highlight in terms of where the data comes from as we go through this presentation, so we're clear, is that this comes from cleanups that are done specifically by our team from people who come to us. This is not meant to be a specific mirror of the ecosystem in WordPress or on the web in general, but this is strictly taken from information that we have internally. All right? So I want that clear. You'll also notice throughout the course that I won't simply touch on WordPress, which is by nature, right? Oftentimes you'll have people with dual CMS installations, or generally you're also dabbling in others if you're an agency because a client might have a specific request. But that will be touched on, so it gives you also a better comparison across the rest of the markets about what the other platforms may or may not be seeing. And last, and not certainly least, again, I touched on, this is cleanups that we do internally. Our cleanups are done manually. So we have staff available 24/7, 365. So if any of them are watching, I would like the crowd to give them a round of applause, because these guys do work a lot to ensure that they're always available to do the cleanups that are needed, whether it's a holiday, it's on vacation. So they do a lot of grunt work, and we have to appreciate them for that. Now, getting into what we can take away from 2021. I'll touch on a few of the major themes or most notable exploits that we saw last year. There's a lot more. The report is very comprehensive, so I don't want you to believe that anything I touch on today is the end of it. There is a lot more, and if you have time, I'll encourage you to read it on our website. But above all things, I want to touch on this, and I want to leave it in plain black and white, so there's no confusion on this. So in 2021, we saw that plugins and extensions accounted for far more compromises than simply having the outdated core on your website. So, it's a shift, and it's been slow, but usually people would often say, well, my WordPress core was up to date, or if they were infected, they could point to the fact that they hadn't gone to the latest version due to either slow Gutenberg transitions or whatever the case was years ago. But now it's shifted. Now we're looking at the actual plugins and extensions themselves. And I'm going to go back to this slide a couple of times throughout the presentation to kind of hammer down that point. But the last part, right, more than the outdated CMS files themselves, that is still not something to omit. It's still not something to overlook. So let's take a look at the breakdown of what we're seeing when we get a website at what I'm going to refer to as the points of infection, the moment we receive a website to get cleaned. So over half the websites we receive, regardless of the platform they were built on, were outdated, which is kind of remarkable in two senses, right? I think most people actually would anticipate, oh, an infection had to be because you're out of date. Well, no, that's not the case, really. So coin flip, essentially. So meaning a good chunk of these people had updated software and found themselves infected anyway. So consider that. Let's consider the comparison across different platforms. So now this graph will show specifically how many websites were out of date by percentage for each platform. So essentially anyone that was on vBulletin that came to us, every single installation were out of date. With that context, look at WordPress. So half of the websites that came to us were out of date. But that also means the other half were fine in terms of where there's core software we're running. Again, I want you to understand that while that's great because that means, you lead most platforms and making sure you're up to date with software, which is really easy to do, right? That, you get online, they remind you 6.0 is up or what, versions out. And you can do that pretty quickly without worrying about compatibility issues. Suppose you were on Magento and you were working through 2.0. That becomes a hassle. But you compare that to 2 years ago. And so now you're seeing that there's actually an uptick in sites that are outdated on WordPress. So meaning people are not doing as diligent a job. Again, it could be a number of factors. One of the factors, as a hypothesis, is simply the shift in the number of people that have moved online, right? A small, minor, little global event happens, and so suddenly a lot of people that were used to in-person engagements and sales and businesses shifted online. Whether that accounts for this slight change, hard to say. But we'll touch on some more of what can validate that line of thinking in terms of the people that are getting online, using WordPress and getting on there. Here, we're going to now focus back on the plugins, right? So, as I touched on a few slides ago, vulnerable plugins and extensions are accounting for far more compromised environments than the core files themselves, right? It's good to touch on that, but let's get to the meat of what's going on here. So, I'm going to illustrate here by percentage the top 10 plugins and extensions that were found when a website was infected and brought to us. Now, it's good to see, because if you have these, it's good to make sure that you have these up to date, or if you're planning to use them, to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to keep them up to date. Speak to yourself, whether it's you are running the website yourself, you're a developer, whomever is in full management and ownership of your website, should constantly be making sure that your inventory of software is always up to date. But one thing I'll highlight is this, Timthum. So, another aspect about why websites get infected are not often always, oh, it had to have been something completely new because I had everything up to snuff. Not always the case. Sometimes, what you'll often find is, as an agency, you might have older clients, legacy clients that are sitting inside of what we phrase as an environment. An environment meaning the server where you have multiple websites hosted, all right? And what you'll often see is a legacy client who doesn't want to change anything. Perhaps he made some customizations. But the reason I'm highlighting Timthum here is because while this is the second leading reason we saw an infection, 2021, this vulnerability is actually over 10 years old. 10 years old. People running a plugin over 10 years old on versions of that. And the reason I can say that with certainty, we wrote about it over 10 years ago. But you often will see agencies, managed providers that keep installations like this with old software that old for a very long time. And so one of the things I will recommend in a situation like this, if perhaps you're in a position like this, right? Kind of strung by the fact that you have a client that doesn't want to pay a premium to move to a different server or whatever the case is, figure out a way to isolate those that you are doing a very good and diligent job with away from those that aren't. Because often this is actually what happens. You get an older client or a parked installation somewhere, you forget about what you installed, and then an infection happens and it wrecks your entire weekend, and you have to clean up everything and find a provider to help you, right? More to the point, let's talk about the types of software we're seeing infected. This particular graph, what I want to kind of articulate to you more than anything is the popularity of them. So in the third column, you'll see the number of active installations that those pieces of software have, right? And look, a lot of those names are prominent. You have WooCommerce, who's one of our sponsors here, Ninja Forums, among others. And it's not to say that, there's anything specifically wrong with them. By all means, that is not the impression. But simply, you're going to have attackers that are looking for the widest net to use against the widest audience. So they're going to seek out very popular plugins, stuff that you might find is really cool, very helpful. Friends told you, oh yeah, you get online, you've got to make sure you click X, Y, Z, follow this checklist, this online checklist for getting started with WordPress is great, just follow it blind, don't even worry about it. Well, not so blindly. And so you have to make sure that, when you're putting together your website or perhaps making new changes, you're conscious of the fact that, look, infections are going to happen. And no matter how popular the plugin is, no matter how small it may be, there's always a risk for this to happen. It's not specifically about you. It's simply what is the attacker going for? And we'll go into some of their motives in a little bit. Now, what are the methods they're using? What are some of the techniques? We'll focus more in this presentation about something called hack tools, kits, suites would be another word. And essentially, what these are designed to do is essentially empower an attacker to run automation to get access to websites. So in 2021, what we saw were a fifth of the websites that we touched at the point of infection, again, the moment we received these websites, they had a hack tool incorporated. And some of these hack tools can do very different things, right? Some of these can create mass defacements. Defacements we'll touch on in a few minutes. Some of these others can create DDoS attacks, if you're not familiar with that terminology. DDoS meaning a volume-based threat, essentially designed to kill the availability of your website, amongst other stuff. But one of the things that was most popular, and that I think a good number of people in the room might be familiar with, is Anonymous Fox. Has anyone here heard of Anonymous Fox? Good number of hands. So, for those that don't know, Anonymous Fox is still a very major threat to WordPress sites that are built on cPanel. Okay? And so what would happen is they would take, they would reset your cPanel email, get the password reset email sent back to them, and they essentially got access into that, which inevitably got them access into your WordPress installs. Right? It was a very big thing. cPanel's very popular. So one of the things that you have to understand is that this became so prevalent is that it became very difficult for people to even know that they were infected. This wasn't like, hey, you get on your website and you saw a defacement, meaning someone maybe scrubbed the front page and said, haha, you were hacked by me. It wasn't like that. You wouldn't have known, really, because they would have installed probably other software in the back end that were running other malicious scripts. You just would not have known unless, let's say, you were trying to log in, all of a sudden you couldn't. Now, as I mentioned, we do quite a bit to provide resources back to the community to share about what we're seeing with these kinds of threats. And we do have a guide that kind of talks through what it is and how to do it yourself. But I'll touch on a couple of things that you should highlight. But just know that this is something that's still very prevalent. I think not 2 weeks ago, I was working with an agency that had about 200 sites that were infected with this threat. But long before that, it was a week prior, and the smaller agencies that came. But this is very common last year, and it's still common this year. I suspect if I'm here a year from now, I will mention this again, because there's no slowdown. So if you've ever been impacted by this, and you got to sort it out because you're reverted to a backup, but don't actually have a plan in place to prevent this moving forward, reach out to our guide. But I'll touch on what this did, right? So essentially, Anonymous Fox was primarily targeting these two areas in your cPanel. They were looking to reset the contact email in there, as I mentioned. And once they did that, they would send themselves a reset email, password to get themselves access, and also add secondary emails just in case. Now, these emails often ended up being burner emails. So even if you wanted to report them, even if you wanted to do something about them, those emails likely existed for about 2 minutes, and then they were gone. All right? Another thing they would do is install malicious plugins within your file structure. So here you'll see the highlighted blue are the folders that they created. But there are other legitimate plugins in there, right? You have DB Booster all-in-one. Those are legitimate plugins and very prominent ones. But then you see malicious stuff like that, and if you're not always looking within your file directories, you probably would never have seen it. But those directories led to software that would often either create spam mailer scripts, credit card skimmers most prominently, and other things like that. So keep that in mind, right? These are things that you would likely not know if you weren't more or less in the weeds on what's going on with every aspect of your website. monitoring, detection can often be a good tool for this. What file changes, what folder changes have been made within last 4 days, 7 days. Oftentimes, the biggest thing is visibility. People tell me, I just had no idea I even had an issue to begin with. Couldn't know. It wasn't until a client told me that their credit card got flagged and I had to look at my own stuff. So imagine how long that infection took place. So, as post-infection steps, some things you can touch on is, of course, disabling the reset password for cPanel. Changing your WP admin username as well, because often what they would do is once you get access to cPanel, they would go in, reset that. And truth be told, if you're not changing your WP admin by default anyway into something either complex or otherwise, you're doing yourself a disservice. I'll touch on that on the very end, but out of the box, default setups often invites potential threats. Not to scare, I'm not trying to generate fear here. It's awareness, right? What can I do to better position myself with not just Anonymous Fox, but other types of exploits that may take similar avenues that they did, right? Now, of course, remove any bogus emails that they created, because as I mentioned, they may create several, not just the one. Make sure you're reviewing those users as well and reset everything back to how it was before, and find a layer of protection that can proactively block those threats. The URL there is to the guide I had touched on a couple slides ago. If you want to take a picture, jot it down for later, either way, it's a very useful guide to help give you awareness of what it did, how to clean it, and how to prevent it. Ransomware. I think this is fairly popular. But for those that don't know, ransomware is an attack vector where you are essentially encrypting the website's files and database, locking it up with a private, an encryption key that then someone holds hostage over you. And so you'll see a landing page like this. They tell you, hey, for a Bitcoin or for X amounts of your currency, send it to this account. And then I'll give you your site back. A lot of universities became susceptible to this for several years. But the change here is not simply that ransomware has an uptick or anything like that. It's that it's not actually ransomware. They're defacements. They're fake ransomware. What they'll do is put up a page like this on your website, but otherwise your files and database are fine. So what they're trying to do is prey on the fear that you may have been taken hostage, that you don't take the 2 minutes to actually check to see if your files are available, and you go ahead and pay the ransom anyway. So it's an attack based on the threat of another. And that's the kind of evolution we're talking about here. Like, what are they going to see in terms of what potential looming threats someone may suspect they have, and then how do they respond in those situations? But this has now become more prevalent in terms of what type of defacements we're seeing. Now they're ransomware defacements. So if ever you are faced in a situation like this, and you see something similar, hey, I've got your site, actually make sure they do. Because in reality you may not, and you may have to just revert to a backup of what your home page actually looked like. But this has become more common, so something to keep in mind. So in terms of the distribution of these types of attacks, malware, as it's known, I'll show a comparison to, again, 2 years ago, all right, to give enough time to understand where the growth is. So, again, hack tools was a topic we touched on. And so hack tools has doubled since 2 years ago. All right, defacements has seen an uptick. Again, similarly, because of stuff like I just showed you. And so these types of attacks are always evolving to different ways. These bars may look different in a few years, right? Let's say spam might go down, mailer scripts may not be as popular because of what was looking to be accomplished. But understanding where these trends are going gives us a better idea of, hey, yeah, there's something here that we need to account for. And the biggest single uptick in trend that we're seeing are in credit card skimmers. Does anybody not know what a credit card skimmer is? So there's a few. That's good. So for those that don't, a credit card skimmer is essentially a tool or script used to essentially steal credit card information if you're running an e-commerce website. And so, again, it's on the rise. And what hacker groups are really actually trying to do here is get the most ROI on the time and effort they're spending on an attack like this. And they're becoming more and more common and exploit kits running on WordPress. Okay? One of the things that you have to understand is most attacks often, what are you gaining out of that? Well, nowadays, it's more financially driven, right? If I can get money, whether it's because of a fake ransomware threat, whether it's sending me the Bitcoin, whether it's because I can steal credit card information and sell that in the dark web, money will always be a major primary factor in how attacks start, especially when you're talking about a global pandemic that forces people at home. So what then happens? Whatever previous financial resources you had start becoming more limited, and people get tempted, desperate, and try stuff like this. By CMS, you're going to see here, WordPress takes up a pretty major thing here, right? You have tools like WooCommerce, or you might have other managed WordPress website installations that are helping create an online card e-commerce experience. Well, with a market share as big as WordPress has, it's a very easy target to hit, right? SiteCheck is a free tool that we have, sitecheck.sucuri.net. What you can use is you can enter your domain, see what potential existing malware infections or errors or issues that you have, and it gives you a better, arm yourself with more information. But SiteCheck is also good for us, because then we get to see what other people are trying to get information for. So one of the things we saw is, why did it go black? One of the things we saw is that WordPress, in the middle of last year, if you see the little green laser there, overtook Magento, a major e-commerce platform, for having the most CC skimmers detected. And if you see that graph, that disparity just kept growing. And again, this is more about the ease of getting on a WordPress platform. People who were brick and mortar now suddenly switching to online e-commerce or online payment options, right? You're at a restaurant, they send you to a website to pay for your bill, or otherwise now you're at markets, and now you're on Etsy type shops. But now that's increasing, right? That's right there the point of increase. And actually, before going into summarizing everything, last night, Ben Martin, who is one of our team lead remediation analysts, right? He's been with us and he's most experienced on the staff, so I want to give him a shout out. But one of the things he noticed is that on SiteCheck, in 2021, credit card skimmers were detected on a third of all websites that were pushed through that scanner. So 1 out of every 3 websites had a credit card skimmer. From January 1st of this year to this past Wednesday, that number has grown to 63%. So now 2 out of every 3 websites have a credit card skimmer detected when pushed through our scanner. That is a very sharp increase. So now, because of how prevalent e-commerce is, that's just going to become more and more common. Let's summarize what we saw that year. Log4j vulnerability in Apache. Anyone having to have issues dealing with that in the crowd? I see hands going up. That was very popular and very critical at the time. But that is something to keep in mind about how often the climates change and how much the impact was, because this is a very severe vulnerability on your servers, specifically on Apache servers. But this is something to keep in mind, that these things can happen on a dime. Right? Again, I'll highlight that extensions accounted for more infections than just simply having outdated core. Default configurations, right? Out of the box setups, often not the best in terms of security. They make it easy for you, but make it also easy for attackers to anticipate patterns or URLs, know where to hit. SEO spam will continue to increase, right? This is always very helpful for attackers. This was no surprise. But again, I'll highlight credit card skimming. Okay? Credit card skimming is on the rise. So if you yourself, or you have a client that is running an e-commerce platform, again, I'm not looking to generate fear, but awareness. This is a known thing, and with the frequency we're seeing it, it's happening much more often. Okay? Backdoor files as well, create many compromises. These often end up being remote code, file upload executions and stuff that maintain access for attackers to do something else down the line. The backdoor files often sit there for months. You would never know. That's why detection tools or software services are key. Knowing when you have a problem, which often ends up being the #1 problem with most agencies that we see. They presume they have security plugins installed that are protecting stuff, but they have no visibility anywhere else, and they have no idea what else could be the problem. Now, again, a forecast for next year, and this is where I'll wrap up. We're already seeing, through the end of May, a spike in credit card skimmers, and they're likely going to be more evasive, more complex in how they're hidden, because again, at the end of the day, the more they can put an effort into a single exploit kit that then can get most amount of sites infected, therefore the most reach to e-commerce activity and credit cards, the more profitable this becomes for that attacker. So these types of infections will likely continue to grow, or at the very least become more complex. So DIY cleanups might also become more complex. And again, I'm not saying you shouldn't or shouldn't, but it's just something to keep your mind on. The longer the malware stays on the website, the more this helps the attacker, okay? And again, I'm not trying to say anything specifically bad about how WordPress or any other platform provides an ease of experience, but out of default configurations or out of the box default configurations are often not good. All right? So with that, thank you. I hope you did take something away from in terms of what to anticipate and how to be proactive. But yeah, I'm ready for some questions.
Thank you, Victor.
Yeah.
We have a microphone right in front of us here for anyone having questions. Please line up in front of the mic, state your name and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, my name's Zach. Do you have the ability to go back?
Could you come a
to
little
the
closer
slides?
to
Yeah, a
the
little
mic?
closer.
Yeah, can you hear that?
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay, perfect. Do you have the ability to go back in the slides? I was kind of curious about the slide that showed the percent of updated.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see. Well, I don't know if they'll show. Oh, perfect. Okay, so you're talking about outdated CMSs, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I got you. All right, so this one or the one prior?
Yeah. So I was kind of curious how to interpret this data because there's a few different ways of looking at it.
Sure.
Is it that you're just dealing with a lot more WordPress-based sites, or is it that like Typo 3 is inherently more secure? Because if something's up fully to date, like it's saying that Typo 3, 100% of the sites that were compromised were out of date.
Yeah,
right.
I
Are you
think
just dealing with less of them, or how to interpret that?
no, the volume actually year over year is about the same, right? Like because there's larger web presence, you have just more sites in general. It's a good question. So this is honestly more of a half glass full, half empty philosophy. If you're a half glass full type of person, you're likely seeing this and realizing, man, people are still really doing a good job as WordPress being, of course, leading that market in terms of, hey, we're doing better a job at getting our people to get their stuff updated in terms of the core than other platforms, right? Or we make it easier to do so. That's the half glass full version. So it's actually a commendation to some extent. The half glass empty, though, is that because of how large our market share, and I probably could have improved on the slide by touching on the volume, the raw number itself, but that because of how large WordPress is, 50% of WordPress is still going to be more than those 4 columns on the far right.
Yeah.
So that's still a large presence of the web running on outdated core web files. And again, but that also could be attributed to the fact that people are still working through a transition into Gutenberg style editing and all that stuff. That often ends up being a case. Or you've made custom core modifications, which they tell you never to do, but you may have a client who asks you to do it because they need something really funky to happen on the website, and the only way to do it is mess with core. So that often ends up being the case, and so those sites are perpetually outdated. And that often becomes an issue. So it's a half glass full, half empty thing. And you can look at it and say, well, it's not bad. WordPress is getting the message out. Or we're doing a better job than Magento or some of the others. But because of the raw number of WordPress sites, it also is an issue as well. Hope that helps.
Awesome. Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Please step up to the mic.
Sure.
Your name and question, please, and speak as close to the mic as you can.
So my name's Helen. I'm interested to know if that many websites have got credit card skimmers on them, how come people's bank accounts aren't being emptied all the time?
Repeat the last part of that question, I'm sorry.
How come people's bank accounts aren't being emptied all the time?
So that ends up often being more about the opportunity they end up using, because you'll find skimmers detected, but are they being actively used? Because you might have malware that's dormant. So we call it initially dormant. So they'll infect a website, but they wait. I had cases where I had a client who, when they went back to look at the file modification dates, had seen the backdoors placed 6 months prior. So imagine you have a file or a skimmer or other scripts sitting in your file structure for 6 months, not doing anything yet, really because they wanted to evade immediate, either immediate detection or otherwise because they were waiting to establish a larger network to then run everything, because they also need the resources to get that done. So it's not to say like, oh, 60% of those sites had a CC skimmer and they were all active at that time. Not always the case. Sometimes what happens is you might have a host that has pretty robust monitoring technology, and so then they'll tell you something has been placed there in the last 24 hours. And so that person may go to our website, put in that site, and yeah, sure enough, the script is there. It doesn't mean that it's running yet. But there are also cases where I've had some people who would go on holiday, tell me, man, I'm getting all kinds of, chargebacks, or people requesting refunds, telling me I did not place this order from this card and my credit card company reported me. That does happen. And so businesses suffer. Not so much the people who put their card through, but the businesses also then have to suffer the consequences on what happens after the fact. Some people do get suffered, and sometimes also smaller charges, right? It's not like, oh, they're going to spend $45,000 or euros out of your bank account and drain you dry. They want to be unsuspecting, so little charges here and there. But when you cast a net of 50,000 sites, let's say, then the per user that's hit isn't as important, right? So there's multiple layers to that. So it's not. So it could be that they're active, but they're so small you're not noticing, which often means you have a charge on your account that you don't know is there, or otherwise they're just not ready yet, and so you get them before you can kickstart anything. But they're there, and that's really what happens.
Thank you.
Hi, step to the mic, please. Your name and your question.
Hi, I'm Lech. I was wondering, with the latest WordPress releases being focused on Gutenberg, if you have observed any sort of specific attacks of, vectors of attack or strategies that were aiming Gutenberg specifically, or REST APIs, for example, that Gutenberg relates on.
So that actually is a good topic. I actually don't have information specific to that, but I would like to explore that as a new topic. So thank you for the idea. But yeah, because Gutenberg was very much like a flashpoint for a lot of people in terms of how they manage WordPress. Maybe how malware has changed since then, and even some recent versions. But that would actually be a good topic. So I don't have an answer, but I would like to explore that. So if you follow me and I end up doing a talk somewhere else, I'll likely be touching on that topic.
Right, thank you.
No, thank you.
Hello,
Hey.
I'm Livio. I'm actually going to be asking questions that were sent to the live stream, so people are at home, they're watching.
Sure.
So
Hi, everybody.
the first one is from, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, but it's Karkit Shukla. So the question is, security is one of the common issue in convincing the client to adopt WordPress as a CMS. How do you explain the situation to the client?
So, for those that may not have heard, how do you explain the importance of security to a client looking to set up on WordPress, right? Why, specifically that has to be a big focus. WordPress, as we all know, is a community-driven project. But what that essentially means, of course, is the likelihood of human error. So different people working on different aspects, leading different versions of WordPress, right, new releases. Oftentimes, things slip, right? You're not escaping something correctly or whatever the case may be. So there will always be evolutions of maybe even older threats that come back because attackers are constantly running automation to see what's new. And as WordPress becomes more and more prominent, what you're also going to see are very green WordPress users that have no idea what they're doing. They set up everything, they don't set up any precautions, but it impacts you because you might be on a shared hosting platform. Again, it's not an indictment on shared hosting, but just you might be stuck in an environment where somebody else is doing a bad job and you're suffering the consequences for that. So oftentimes you're doing everything right, but then you get infected because somebody else did, right? Or otherwise you're doing everything right, but they still find a new tactic to get in. It's no different than in reality as ammunition's changed over time, right? You're piercing different armor. Fine, we're going to create something that penetrates that a little less. And they find something else to get around that. And so, yeah, there's an evolution. The same thing here. So I don't want the client has to understand that things are going to change. And what you don't want, it says, if you're speaking to the clients, is, hey, look, we could spend 1/10 of the cost right now to prevent an issue or proactively be prepared for an issue, or you can pay me the hours to then try and find a service that may or may not be able to help us, and then we might have to spend more time and days. Oh, and by the way, if the site you want is an online shop and this is taking 3 days and you're not getting any sales on those days, now you're losing the money you should have been gaining across that time to begin with. That's one way to kind of hit that hard for clients.
Hi, my name's Arno. I was wondering, how do you go about knowing that you've been affected with a credit card skimmer? Because if I understand it correctly, the client orders something on your website, steals the credit card information, uses it for malicious appliances, but how do you know that it's because of your website that their information is hacked?
Well, that's more difficult. So, I mean, you'll often get a feel for whether it's you as to how many callbacks you're getting from people who purchased. Let's say they purchase something from you, and then they go to the next store, or the next cafe, and all of a sudden their card's blocked. And then, or someone else, makes an order, but then all of a sudden, they're seeing additional charges ramp up. And so, like, I know this happened to some family of mine where they're trying to retrace their steps. Like, well, where did I use this card last that I didn't know for a fact that it was reliable? Like, I was just making Amazon purchases for the last, couple of days, nothing else. The last thing I did was go to this website that I don't normally go to. So that ends up being a key as to maybe being a you thing. It's not always going to be you. But to be cautious, if, say, one person came up to you and suspected such a thing, it's always good to check it. If you have an active security service in place that offers free reviews, as an example, as we do, then just have them scan for it. Hey, look, I don't know. We often get that. We often get a lot of, hey, I don't know if I'm infected, but I saw something odd or I heard something weird. Can you just check it anyway? And, we'll come back to you and be like, no, nothing's weird here, but we would recommend doing X, Y, and Z. Or otherwise, we'll affirm the fact that, hey, yeah, here are the 45,000 files and directories that were impacted as part of this hit. Because it wasn't just a skimmer, but a bunch of other stuff that got into. So cautious is always best. Like, if may or may not be you, and if at worst a security service tells you no, we tell you no, go back to the client, look, it wasn't us. And I just had my security team tell me that everything is clean on my site. See what else it could have been. But it's always hard to know.
Yeah, so you're really relying on your customers to give you the information that there might be something.
That's the pain of it, right? Like, you don't know unless, let's say, you have a host that blocks you and shuts you down because they've detected the skimmer on your site, right? Because, again, one thing to know is visibility is not a one-stop place. You should have different ways of getting your sites monitored. Make sure the host that you have has detection tools in place. On top of that, get your own. Maybe you enlist another service. Because everyone's going to be carrying different types of signatures. And it can be any one of those that help key you in on the fact that you have an issue. It's not to say anyone else is doing a bad job, but again, we have different ways of checking for things. So that's why visibility is always going to be key.
We need to wrap up.
Sure, sorry.
Did you have one question that is a short one? Possibly? Go
I'll make it a short answer, hopefully.
Hi, I'm Agnes, and it's awesome to have a security talk at this WordCamp, so thank you. My question would be that you mentioned plugin vulnerabilities, and I wanted to ask, what would be your recommendation on tackling that problem as it being a big problem in WordPress security?
like the best recommendation generally on WordPress security, you mean?
In terms of plugin vulnerabilities.
Oh, plugin vulnerabilities. Okay, so for me, it's going to be twofold, and I'll keep it short. And I'm going to say this word again, visibility. Knowing where your inventory is. Knowing what plugins you have, whether they're inactive or active, is often the best thing, because what often happens is in the beginning, I know this happened with my website, you start clicking stuff. You start installing things. Everything's cool. But then you leave it alone because you're never going to use it, or your motive changes. So the key thing there is to remove those plugins that you're not using. If you don't use it, then lose it. Keep track of that. If you're managing it for a client, similarly, keep an inventory of these things. And whenever you meet up with your client, whether it's on a monthly basis or every 6 months, make sure, hey, look, we've got these plugins that do this, but do we still need them? If they say no, get rid of them. In addition to that, make sure that if you're entrusting someone to do this for you, that they are checking for that. And they're also checking that these things are updated on a regular basis. When you're selecting plugins, which is the last thing I'll touch on in terms of just getting to that point, make sure the plugins are popular, that they have frequent updates, right? Because in that way you know that they're always touched versus abandoned for 6 months and susceptible in those cases, okay? I can go on and on, but that's really the key on how that
We
works.
really need to wrap up.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor.
What is this?
And this one's for you.
Oh, that's awesome. You guys see that? It's a little rooster there. So do I roll this off the stage? Is this how this works?
Yeah? Yeah.
I'm so tall. Cool, perfect. Well, anyway, thank you guys. And on to the next session, yeah?